in the chat box. I will prioritize closing opposition. I will start my speech in 3.
Oh, sorry. I think the LO is going to be sharing the timer or not. If not, I need to like open my timer. I'll just open my timer. Sorry for that. You can go on. Hi, yes, you can start your speech.
Okay. I will start my speech in 3. Wait. Okay. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Several important setup in opening government that I think all teams in this debate need to comply. One, in opening government, we will recognize the influence of politician public statement as mitigating factor when riot happen. This looks like followers of Trump in 6 January Capitol Riot or Prabowo's followers in post-election against Jokowi by 3 mechanizations. One, we still conduct trial and court obviously to make sure the sentence and use of the mitigating factor become fair. But second, if we know that these people do riot because of influence of the politicians, whether this is expression of support and oppose, we are going to reduce their punishment. But thirdly, we more than willing to open the court to public to know the reason and what kind of mitigating factor that reduce their sentences. For example, with the politician, from what political party they come from, for example, because in current context, even the another like court and trial being open publicly to make sure that the process and the result of court become transparent. So this is also can be applied in this kind of trial. But second, note that the framing to make this debate become clear and more substantial that I think all teams need to follow is this debate is not merely and only talking about followers that blindly follow their political figure such as Trump, but we also talking about riot that happen because of certain statement come from politicians that makes public angry. The parallel example is like Ahok when they making statement that makes public riot and doing demonstration such as 212 for example that against Ahok, because when someone do inflammatory statement it means what they say or do is likely to make people react. So OG will analyze why this is justified for both people that do and also support this political figure. Why this is fair and necessary parameter in principle and also practical, but second, why this is give form of check and balance to the politician, and why this is fair check and balance and proportional punishment. But move to my first argument, why this is fair and necessary parameter. I think that the context that we need to establish is the first thing to know that mitigating factor exists because to some extent we recognize that the reason why these people or the perpetrator do some bad deeds is because influence of externalities. That is why in current context, mitigating factor used when they know and analyze the background of the perpetrator, for example, just mental condition, social background, and like it means they do this not merely because of evil, like motive. I want to prove to you why most of the time these people that want to do this, like riot and public instability is because of externalities. 3 things. One, because most of the time the influence of the politician is really strong because of cult or personality that use the cult of personality to their followers, for example, by saying that Trump is the only savior that can save them, for example, that can make America great again, for example, that like Democrat siding to the immigrant that is so evil, for example, that like to some extent steal their economic opportunity, for example. I think that most of the time these kind of people get blindly exactly because there is less check and balance in their side of the house. But second, I think that even if opposition want to say that, oh, we're talking about most of the time developed democracy, for example, that exposure will be there. I don't care because even when we're talking about the case of US, most of the time people still trapped in their echo chamber when we're talking about politics. We're talking about people like right wing that's still in their own echo chamber that only talking about the perspective of Republican, and so do like the Democrat that also still don't want to engage with the Republican, for example, to exchange of knowledge, because when we're talking about ideology, less likely for people to want to compromise, for example, less likely for people to want to understand what kind of like what kind of the pros of another ideology, because in order for them to do this is at the cost of their, like ancestor, for example, or at the cost of, like all the doctrination that their parents give to them, that at the cost of their acceptance toward their echo chamber. But thirdly, I think that this is justified because their life affected the most by this. What is the problem? Because I think that the framing that we need to agree is the reason why they do riot is because they want to change something wrong that happened. The framing that most likely exists in the debate is riot is the last source of protest to the government, because in both sides of the house, riot is really costly. So less likely for people to want to do this in, like in the first step of protest to the government, because let's be real, riot is really costly. Time, take your time, money, energy, image, job, or even your life and people around you, for example. So less likely when you're most likely when riot happen in current context, it means there is something that is so severe actually in status quo. What kind of things that I want to talking in this debate? Oppression and lack of representation from the politician by several things. One, inequality distribution of the resources, for example, like what happened in Java, for example, when all the resources, like concentrate in Java. But second, exploitative behavior in the name of country that at the cost of people indigenous and people on middle ground. We're talking about wadas and mining coal in Papua, for example. But thirdly, we also to some extent talking about autocrat regime, for example, like what happened in Jokowi era when UUCK exists, for example, or like I don't know, all the fucked up policies by Jokowi that limit the freedom of the people. But lastly, I think we also talking about fucked up and dirty politics, like what happened in Sri Lanka when the politician doesn't have capability to, like make the country become great and achieve stability. I think that most of the time this is justified because in principle this is form of self-defense, because the politician to some extent quote unquote already attack us and it is proportionate to attack them back, right? This is form of proportional punishment to them. But because this is really important, because the harm that most of the time politicians already did toward us is really big and irreversible and traumatize people enormously. We have the right to channel their grievances. Their self-defense is valid to shift the blame to the politician because no alternative work. We're talking about no laws to deter the politician because the high and power asymmetry that exists towards them, for example. But second, when we're talking about campaign or rely, for example, this is still rely on the voluntarism, for example. So they only attract people that only want to listen in the very first place, that most likely being the one that stay in the same echo chamber as them. So there is no significance of alternative in the status quo. But why this is can change the government, for example, or why this is, why this is the only alternative that they can do, because they will think that this is justified and we need to do this because at least politicians can change because of the harm that they impose to them, for example, something that under our side of the house, they don't have alternative except for do this. So I think that like the question that exists in status quo right now is whether or not when these people do this is because of because of the merely irrational action or because of there is legitimate causes that exist. So even if riot is based on anger, for example, or riot to some extent, like this make society unstable, for example, this is for greater good because they need to show the gravity of the problem, for example, because they want to defend their right, for example, to the people in power or people elites that don't never understand their perspective, for example. So at least under our side of the house, we say that principally and principally and practically, this is their last resort or last source to demand for the government for the better changes. Proud to open this debate.
Thank you for that speech. Let's invite leader of opposition here.
Yeah. POI preference, please do so through chat. I prefer pronounce he and him. Okay. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. What you need to understand is that the process that is described by opening government seems very simplistic. The idea is that when people receive inflammatory rhetoric, the line of thought is inflammatory rhetoric, people getting angry, and people will riot and protest. We believe that people are not as simple as that, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that there is a lot of process that someone can do that can do internally to assess whether or not to proceed with a certain course of action, whether or not they would succumb to emotions that are temporary and are not permanent to do something that has lasting and negative consequences. We think there's a lot of things that people can do internally, and we believe that the motion today will only create a world where it's worse for the criminal justice system and worse for the exact same people, the autocrats and the demagogues that opening government wants to prevent from influencing the masses and the society, ladies and gentlemen. Before moving to my arguments, I have two things that I would like to rebut from the opening government. So first, opening government mentioned that as of now, politicians engage in a cult of personality, and these people who follow them are trapped in echo chambers. We believe that right now, as of now, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, understand that under their side of the house, rhetoric would still continue to exist. Inflammatory rhetoric would still continue to exist. Cult of personality would still continue to exist. Why is that so? Because as long as you have people who are not really interested in politics, for example, in the technicalities of a policy, for example, you're going to have people who follow solely based on personality. That's still going to exist under their side of the house. There's no mechanism whatsoever for them to address that. But secondly, I think the idea of inflammatory rhetorics and cult of personality is going to be even worse under the side of the house. Understand that exactly because people can now say that they're influenced by external factors, that they shift the blame from that they refuse to accept the blame and refuse to be accountable for their actions. And that means that when these things happen again, they can just follow another demagogue, another populist, and say that, hey, I've been influenced by this person and receive a lighter sentence. The incentive is there to always shift the blame to other people. The problem is, in the current status quo, I don't know of any mechanism where people like Trump gets indicted, for example, for influencing the masses or for populists for influencing the masses. When Prabowo did that, there was no investigation whatsoever because I don't think it's part of the law. So in their side of the house, that rhetoric is going to stay, is going to be there as well, cult of personality as well, and it's going to get even worse because people see that this influence can be used as a get away from jail or get a lighter sentences card. That's the incentive that happens in their world. We don't want that. But second, they brought up this point about how these people have valid grievances, that this is fair for people to actually shift the blame to the politicians or demagogues, for example, because there's a lack of distribution in income and because there's been an exploitation of minorities. Understand that the idea of exploitation of minorities and distribution of income is not really relevant in this debate. If you want to address those issues, please come up with another policy and please set up another debate for that. But as of now, we're not debating that. But understand that the idea of fairness, whether or not it's fair for us to shift the blame to other people and to refuse to take accountability for our action, I will explain it in my arguments. Two arguments in my speech. Firstly, why we think that principally this is not justified. This is going to engage with some of the materials coming from opening government. Firstly, understand that how in the current status quo, we can receive lighter sentencing for criminal cases, right? Three scenarios. That can happen if you're a minor, that can happen if you're insane, and thirdly, that can happen if you're a minor, that can happen if you're insane, and thirdly, that can happen when you're conducting self-defense or under attack. Understand that in these three scenarios, there is no choice for the criminal or for the actor to do any other thing. You might say that children can think, children have a choice. They might, but they don't have the capacity to understand the ramifications and consequences of their action. That's why currently in the status quo, they receive lighter sentencing, right? Under the side of the house, we believe that currently as well, we believe that this policy creates, as of now, we believe that the way influence works is that we receive influence from a variety of sources, right? There's no one thing or one source of influence that we can pinpoint the blame to. For example, in the case of January 6th rioters, these people, we can receive influence from a person, for example, from direct communication. We can also receive influence from media, from movies, from podcasts, from TV shows, from pamphlets or materials. We need to understand that we receive influence from a variety of sources, and it's impossible for us to pinpoint it to one source. In the case of January 6th rioters, they don't only receive word from Trump as if Trump is their only source of truth. They have other aspects as well. For example, Fox Media, who always say that Biden stole the election is rigged, for example. They have alt-right group chat, for example, in QAnon, for example. This is the exact same group chat which led to the January 6th rioting, for example. And they also have echo chambers. So they always discuss with the same person, the same lies get repeated over and over again, ladies and gentlemen. So influence is not from a single source only. It's impossible for us to pinpoint it. We say that thirdly, the decision to provide lighter sentencing, the decision to actually conduct a crime lies solely in the hand of the individual. This is the thought process we say that we're missing from the government opening government analysis. You can receive a lot of bad influence, but at the end of the day, it's down to you whether or not you want to conduct those crimes. We think receiving lighter sentencing is not in line with the current norms in the criminal justice system. We receive influence from many sources, and we believe that you have the agency, the choice to actually do the right thing. Secondly, how this policy creates an abuse of criminal justice system. We believe that this policy will incentivize criminals to actually use influence as a valid source of sentence reduction, for example. Under their world, this will look like something, for example, when a boss encourages you to actually embezzle the company funds, when your girlfriend or when your friend encourages you to kill someone they don't like, for example. You can shift the blame and not be accountable by saying that you're being influenced by other externalities. This, firstly, reduces accountability, and secondly, provide an easy way out for people without necessarily understanding the implications of their actions. For a worse world, you want to vote for opening government. For a better world, for opening opposition.
Thank you for that speech. Let's invite Deputy Prime Minister here.
Assalamualaikum, am I audible?
Salam, yes, you are.
Okay, standing. I'm gonna start my speech in 3. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 2 issues in my speech. Firstly, how do we reduce the societal harm? And secondly, let's talk about the informed consent principle that both sides of the house needs to argue on. Firstly, how do we reduce societal harm? Let's frame this debate. OPI by chat, by the way. Law is not only as a means of punishment, but also shape the public perception as a moral compass. The parallel example of this is people feel strongly against LGBT and marijuana when it is not legalized because it is a moral compass, but differently when it is perceived otherwise. This is why LGBT acceptance and, for example, free sex acceptance is more rampant in EU and United States, and not in Indonesia, where zina is against the KUHP, for example. What's happening in status quo? What's happening in status quo is literally opening opposition speech in which the blames are put to the individuals, rioters only, and never to the politicians. The fact that there is no legal repercussions or recognition to the politicians. There is no public call out to what is the speech of the politicians in itself. And secondly, the fact that the full punishment are given to the rioters exclusively and never to the politicians. But why this is evil? There are two principal reasons as to why this is evil. One, there is no consequences to the source of the harm. That I characterize to you that riots have a lot of cost. Like the fact that you can die, the fact that you can get detained with this law that we currently are debating for example, proves to you that the magnitude of it is very huge from the politicians, in which they are willing to sacrifice their life to the rights in itself, but there's no consequences to the source of it that creates a fear and threat to their life in itself, right? Therefore, that's evil. But second thing, Politicians are the most complicit beneficiary in the inflammatory public statement. Why do people, what kind of speech that makes people go to riots, right? In most instances, it is populism, right? The idea, like we versus the common people versus the elites, to increase the urgency of voting this respective political party. This looks like Donald Trump, who like have the idea such as QAnon, like the government is controlled by the certain elites and whatnot. Therefore, we believe that it is evil to let the politicians just go away. What is the comparative then in our side of the house? Two things. One, there will be a public call out in the court. Like for example, when you report and like the court proceeding is done, we will happily publicly announce that this action is happened due to a certain politician inflammatory statement. But secondly, the evidence, if you want to prove as a mitigatory factor, you need to put the evidence in the court, right? Therefore, the statement will be used as an evidence to evaluate, and therefore, in an open court, people can check and balance which kind of speech, for example, makes a certain reaction, for example, and this will also be a legal precedent of certain things. Therefore, people can understand what kind of speech is dangerous, what kind of politicians need to be avoided to, like for example, ensure a safe society, for example. So we agree that cult of personality might still exist in both sides of the house, but the difference in our side is the degree of accountability that does not exist in the opening of opposition. But even if the adjudicator cannot buy the principle because it is too vague or whatever the hell reason, there are two practical reasons as to why you should vote for opening governments. One, the legal evidences shows as a legal precedence, right? Therefore, people like there is more degree of check and balance to that. People can avoid which kind of politician is dangerous, and like there is a legal proof as an objective moral standard as to what kind of political maneuver is evil. But secondly, when you have the precedence, there is a degree of objectivity that is given by the court. But thirdly, even if conservative echo chamber exists in our side of the house, at least what we did is we reduced the danger of the speech. There will be more beware before using the populist narrative, because otherwise there will be publicly called out but by the precedents and evidences that are collected from the court against them, for example, and harmful for their voting. Meaning that populist and hatred will be considered as an objective harm. Therefore, the prevention method will be done against those politicians and to, like, for example, reduce the vote of these populists. The parallel example of this is the moment drugs and mental illness are considered as a mitigatory factor, the fact that it can manipulate the decision-making of individuals, that's the moment government and society hold hands together to solve that problem, right? Because it changed the people's perception that these are very dangerous, right? This is why we have BNN or DENSUS to prevent, like for example, like mental health awareness, to prevent like the mental illness changing the consent of individuals to reduce the harm in the society, for example. Exactly, opening opposition creates a normalization of demagoguery narrative because there is no consequences in that, and there is no perception of an objective harm to that respective speech. We are the only team who prevent this in the future. So even if like cult of personality and echo chamber exists in both sides of the house, the solvency only exists in OG. Before going further, CEO.
Why do you have an incentive to check and balance the politician if in this particular case you will not being punished, you will punish slowly if you are doing a riot because of that statement?
Listen to my earlier part of the speech. The moment this is used as a mitigatory factor means that need evidence of what kind of speech, and therefore it became a legal precedence as to what kind of speech create a worse condition for the society. In your side of the house, it will be a gray area in which there will be a debate on like, maybe this is a legitimate concern, this may be a riot, for example. Therefore, there is no objective perception of harm in your side of the house. This only exists in our side. But lastly, secondly, let's talk about the informed consent, the principle. I think opening opposition even agree, right, of the existing mitigatory factor such as mental illness, religious affiliation, and according to some team, severe ADHD, right? Therefore, opening opposition agree that externalities that can change your perception of certain things is a good mitigatory factor. Let's characterize to you who are the people who are willing to do this kind of riot, right? Let's talk about the conservative. Conservative cannot just escape from Fox News, right? These are the people who live in a
the partisan area, like the only thing that they are able to watch are probably Fox News, and the moment they read CNN or argue against the Fox News, that the moment their family will come to them and saying that they are infidel, for example, or being brainwashed by the government. This is why check and balance does not necessarily exist against the conservative ideology that makes them think strongly against the quote-unquote establishment. But even if we're talking about liberals or BLM, for example, these are the people whose life threatened by the racism, right? These people have no other option. They cannot go to legal repercussion because, for example, they cannot believe them because of the police brutality, for example, and the speeches that the politicians made that can be a policy will harm them. This is why we believe that it is justified and change people's perception and should be a mitigatory factor if informed consent is parameter winning.
Thank you for that speech. Let's invite Deputy Leader of Opposition here. DLO, are you here?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Okay. 1 second. Okay, my name is Finsky. Preferred pronoun she or her. Preferred method of POI would be via chat. Hopefully no verbal interruption. I'm going to time myself also, and I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Panel realized that the very essence of this debate lies about whether or not it should be considered as a mitigating factor. I do not see any response coming from the OG to Nicholas' very own principles about what constitutes as a mitigating factor and what is not. But second of all, realize that under both sides of the house, there is still check and balances to the politicians, right? But the difference is under their side of the house, people will continue to just at most do a public call up and still see these politicians as a cult of personality autocrats that they can even support more, because even if they support and there is like consequences, they will get reduced consequences even if they support all of these politicians, right? And the difference is, at least under our side of the house, we have more check and balances, like what Nicholas told you, that encourages more critical thinking, right? I will prove to you later in my extension why this critical thinking can be further perpetuated under our side of the house, and this will result in more people actually becoming critical to what is happening in the political environment, and they will likely make sure that they do due diligence and check and balances to all these politicians, which will result in a better environment in the future for the country itself. But before I move on to my points of extensions and future implications, I will give 2 points of rebuttals towards the opening government. Number one, I do not see why they claim that check and balances are not going to be done under our side of the house. Realize that investigation and process of opening information to the public is not exclusive under their side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. I do not see why that's the case. Investigation still exists under our side. The difference is we want to send a message that everyone will have the choice at the end of the day, and your choices will lead to consequences, and therefore you should make your choice carefully, right? Under our side of the house, we will still have the process to investigate, all those public statements by the politicians, right? It doesn't magically disappear under our side of the house, but the difference is now people have more incentive to actually listen carefully and consider all factors that lead to consequences and lead to choices, like what Nicholas told you. But if anything, public calls out is also not exclusive under their side. Under their side, people will continue to perpetuate these supports. Second point of rebuttals, I believe that when they claim to you that this will lead to worse like autocrat regimes, I see that is they do, first of all, they do not provide you sufficient analysis on why that would happen, but also under our side of the house, right? We believe that at least when people are being told to be held accountable to their own actions, this will lead them to have more checks and also eventually have more critics when they want to, believe something before they make a decisions. But also, I believe that when they talk about precedents for future cases, I will also prove to you later in my extension why this will be even worse under their side of the house. Now, moving on to my extensions, right? I believe that first of all, at the very principle, and this is what OG, I believe, has not really addressed to you. Like what Nicholas has told you, as a human, we process a lot of information every single day. Just because I feel sad or angry, after watching a video, and I result into a, self-destructive coping mechanism for me, I don't think it is fair for me to blame those videos, because at the end of the day, I was the one who processed it. I looked at a lot of videos and not just that one, and at the end of the day, the decision to resort to that coping mechanism is still under my side of the house, right? So by that logic, ladies and gentlemen, realize that Nicholas has told you the very principle of what constitutes as a mitigating factor and what is not. And the difference lies in whether or not you have the agency and you have the choice to make it, right? If you're a minor, for example, or if you have a mitigating factor under the notion of insanity, that is out of your control. But if you got influenced, ladies and gentlemen, as an average reasonable person, as an adult who's consenting to receiving all those informations, I think that means you, at the end of the day, made the decision on yourself, right? And by that logic, I believe that leads to accountability, and I believe that fairness and justice means people, and here, ladies and gentlemen, it means adults who are able to go to all the riots, like what they characterize to you, should be held accountable. They knew that in those riots there's going to be tear gases, right? They knew that at the end of the day there will be consequences to joining those riots, but they chose to do that anyway because they wanted to show the support to these autocrats, ladies and gentlemen. When this happened, when they reduce a sentence, it's sending a message that it's not purely your fault. You're just a pawn. It's the politicians, so you're just a pawn in this whole political regime. When these writers go out and finish their sentence, reduced sentence, I may say, it's likely to repeat the same thing again, which at the end of the day, they will let themselves again to be blamed because they did not get the agency or the and they didn't take the full accountability of their actions. No, thank you, OG. Accountability of their actions, and the blame was on the politicians' inflamed statements only. This why recognizing influences of public statements can harm the criminal justice system in the long run. One, this will discourage average reasonable person to do due diligence upon processing information, especially political decision related, because the blame is not shifted not on them, but just exclusively politicians, right? Because the goal, I believe that the goal or ideal depiction of criteria of a democratic and rational and progressive society is when the citizens are able to have, a critical thinking and be an average rational person. This looks like being able to process various and polarizing information, right? Realize that even if we want to bite the bullet and say that people will still be influenced, because people are not perfect, because they are not fully rational, they will be influenced. At least on the opposition side of the house, we are sending a strong message in the public, in the investigation process, that we want to educate the public that doing due diligence and self-control is very, very important in a progressive and democratic society, because that means they are able to consider all factors and also external resources like media, for example, television, debate, and etc., like what Nicholas told you. But also, second of all, in the future, the same logic will not be a precedent for similar criminal cases, like the example that Nicholas told you, right? For example, if there is a corruption case in a government body that's being investigated in the court, person A, for example, say that they got influenced by his boss, that it's not actually it's not his fault, he got influenced only, he got dragged into the whole corruption thing, and this will lead to a reduced sentence for him by that logic, by that precedence, right? Because you got external influence. But realize that this will only hamper our criminal justice system, because it takes the very thing that makes it agency, accountability, and the consenting decision to make the choice at the first place. When people realize that they are fully accountable for their own actions and decisions, this will make them think twice and even thrice and even more, ladies and gentlemen. So before they make any decision, they realize that those politicians are not going to save them. Those politicians are not going to magically reduce their sentence. And if anything, they should even criticize those politicians, to take them accountable, to publicly call out and demand punishment for these politicians, because they do not want to get punished. Right? This will drive people to actually be, more critical and realize that their fate is in their hand, and therefore, before they go to a riots and decide to support all these autocrats, they will think twice and even more. And at the end of the day, this will result in a more overall progressive and democratic society. So for all these reasons, we are very opposed. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. Now let's invite the closing half member of government. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to set up my timer first. Okay, so my preferred pronoun is she, they. For PI, just do it through chat. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, I'm going to bring 2 things on my speech. Number 1, I'm going to talk about justifications upon power dynamics, and also why then the inflammatory statement from politicians is important, why it is actually different from another inflammatory statement, for example, coming from media and whatnot. But also, secondly, I'm going to talk about how in the future this affects rally or campaign or riots on people or mass media's views overall. Coming to my first extensions, right? Number 1, talking about justifications, I'm going to talk about power dynamics. I think that it is not fair, right, for you as, for example, as regular person joining in a riot because you have problems, for example, problems that probably caused because of the people in higher positions that currently making your conditions under oppressions due to certain conditions, and while still having your rights not fully properly fulfilled by those people in higher position, for example, to then blame for the condition that you've been suffering, right? Because initially, as of course, regular person, for example, who do not have control to access of policy making or regulation to certain access, for example, you shift this task to those politicians, right, whom you are elected, for example, particularly when you are talking about politicians that share the same ideology or principles as you do, right? But secondly, hence why this comes as a form of check and balance under government side. Even furthermore, you're allowing to certain politicians or party to be complicit, right, in legal proceedings, in which it is something that people usually called out as difficult to directly have this politician accountable in court, for example, or to have certain party held accountable for what they say to the public, for what they do, because exactly they have much more capital in the very first place. They have much more privilege in comparison to these people who are currently complicit in this right that we are talking about, right? This check and balances process is going to be much more better under our set of the house, because we help the politicians, but we are not simply going to put the blame on them or turning people to just constantly shift the blame on politicians every time the exact same thing happen, right? I think that since we talk about how it is going to be a legal procedural method will still be exist, as in the investigations itself, for example, we're not going to do press release the moment that we haven't yet finished the investigations, or we're not going to also encourage other people to throw any, for example, false accusations in regards of the events towards the rioters or towards the politicians itself, right? Hence, I do not think that it is as simple as to how, okay, people could just simply again blame these politicians, or we're simply going to actually, put the blame towards the politicians itself, because we're still going to conduct investigations itself fairly, both for it and also for the politicians, right? We're saying that this is going to be much more better because now we have this huge part that is, for example, like politicians or this particular party that is politician coming in to be actually directly talk and also directly, giving the proof to the court, for example, or also complicit in legal proceedings, something that actually, sometimes really, really hard to do for these people, for these regular people who do not much power as much as they do, right? But secondly, why then the inflammatory statement from politicians is actually important and different in comparison to statement coming from media and whatnot, for example. It is different, right, to how media respond to riots or campaign, because as politician, you initially have moral obligation, for example, to fulfill the demand of the people that have chosen you and so on, or the demand of the people that currently, asking for certain justice, for example, to riots and whatnot. So the moment that you're trying to shift an inflammatory statement to, I don't know, attack or influence certain movements or riots, or even to influence your own followers to actually attack certain movements, to actually be sentiment about certain movements, it means that you're abusing your power that you currently have over these people, right? But even worse, you're in between these followers that this politicians held accountable with, right? But because now you're not only going to have, a figure who constantly being sensitive towards your movement, for example, but you're going to also have, have a whole mess that could the movement itself due to the influence of these politicians. But secondly, I'm going to talk about how this rally or campaign or riots on people or mass media views, right? Media here, we know that media have various spectrum as to how, of course, there will be plenty of media talking about different views towards the movement. But most of the times too, media are easily manipulated to actually create certain public agreement, for example, or public opinion towards when certain riots or certain events happening. Simply, of course, because media can be easily influenced by the politics that is currently happening, or even by certain people who wanted to shape certain public agreement through the media in the very first place, right? So what does it mean? It means that riots or a campaign that probably cost so much energy and of course time to build a mass, to build people who actually wanting to sacrifice their life in terms of is speaking up for their right or speaking up for what's matter for them, are fairly vulnerable in the very first place due to how the influence of politics or power, for example, would how it would influence mass media views as well. But secondly, what's going to happen then under government side of the house? Within that under government side of the house, the moment such riots or campaign happen, for example, people now are not going to only focus or spotlight these issues upon the rioters itself, because on most media outlets, for example, people are currently focusing on how this mass of people creates violence and for nonsense reasons, for example, and whatnot, right? Why people could actually influence how this rights is being shaped, creates inflammatory comments and whatnot, right? But I think under our side of the house, now people also going to pay more attention to the behavior of the politicians itself, to the pattern of this inflammatory speech that they currently shift their followers, for example, and how it's going to actually shape their followers, and so also it's actually going to force people to do riots, right? Hence why under our side of the house, we think in terms of influence towards another party like media, it is also going to be much more better, because people are not only simply having a reads that talks about how you have to blame these rioters, but also you have also reads or media that talks about how these politicians is actually could have actually influence or power to actually shift these riots or campaign to be happening and whatnot. That's why we believe that under our settled house it will be much more better. We're proud to
For that speech, let's invite members.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
You are trying muting yourself. Me taking one from 3, 2, 1. 5 points of framing before I move on to my speech. Firstly, this debate happens inside the court. The context side specifically said during prosecution trial means that there have already been an individual incarcerated to a certain extent. And this debate happens inside the court in the decision making of that particular court. I'm surprised that this particular characteristic and clarification just come out in CO, but we have what we have. Secondly, note that not all riot leads to incarceration, but there are special cases where it does lead to court and prosecution trial. For example, even a riot as big as the one that is caused by Habib Rizik doesn't lead to anyone gets into trial. A lot of riot happens from the Democrat, for example, not a lot of individuals are prosecuted. If there are extreme riots such as the 6th Capitol Riot, then there's a couple of things that you can take away from this. Firstly, it means that this exists in a polarized politics for it to be this extreme. Secondly, this means the riot that we are specifically talking about are that strong and destructive to be incarcerated and to be inside the court in the very first place. Thirdly, this takes away a lot of government argument because riot exists in spectrum, and doing it relatively peaceful is possible in this particular extent. The very fact that there are precedents where there are riots that is not incarcerated proves that there is an active decision that is made by this individual to go to this extreme extent. In a polarized politics, there are strong incentives to listen and compromise because both sides are strong. What this means is, inside government, there is no need to this extreme measure because compromise will be made with the midterm election or the fact that there are gray area individual. This proves the active decision that this individual made. Fourthly, note that most of the times while we prosecute not every single protester, but rather the one that actively brought massive damages. This means two things. Firstly, because when opposition says it's hard to prosecute politicians, like government says it's hard to prosecute politicians, they shot themselves in the leg because then the comparative on government is that you prosecute on opposition, you hold them someone accountable versus on-site government, you hold no one accountable because it's hard to prosecute politicians. The same way with CG argument about prosecuting politician. We would like to do both, prosecute the politician and the protester. Why is it so hard? Thirdly, the process of mitigating factor is not provided by the court. Likely, the court simply does not offer this to the individual and to the victims. Your lawyer provides this option of defense, and you have to admit it as an individual. We're going to extend this and say that abandoning it as an external factor and not an action that they believe in actively invalidates political perspective, and I'm going to explain this in my extension. But fourthly, what government should defend is two things: a court process that actively justifies horrendous act, because specifically we're talking about horrendous riot. Secondly, mitigating factor that, yes, perhaps protect the conservative, but invalidates their perspective and ensures that they are only bigoted who are brainwashed as opposed to individuals who have active belief. Lastly, specifically, CO agrees that riot is bad. The method of expressing yourself should be made better. But just because it is bad in the method that you should do it, doesn't mean that the political belief that you have is inherently justified to be invalidated. There are issues about immigration, somewhat valid. There are issues about the economic crisis, somewhat valid, even though the means of expressing it is not bad, is particularly bad. Two responses. Firstly, OO only argues that these people have done an active decision. While we think this might be true, this is not charitable to people who has actual belief that government defend. Opposition and CO is going to flip this and say you defended them better on our side and you made their life worse on side government. Secondly, raise the section about objective reflective of harm and track record so that you can, quantify what actually causes a bad impact and such. I think this is marginal and symmetrical. Like, you can also create research out of riot. A lot of research and news media outlets actually are out after the 6th riot, so why does it matter? But also, just because I have ADHD doesn't mean I'm easily influenced, Reinhard. Like, just because I'm easily distracted doesn't mean I'm easily influenced. Those two are different things. Like, come on, dude. Like, CG argument and OG argument about these people being political belief being valid is going to be rebuttal. Is going to be integrated in this extension. To extension, then, firstly, how mitigating factor actively empower the political that this victim believes in, and secondly, how this increase more inflammatory language in political discussion, if I have the time. So how is it that mitigating factor actually devour the political perspective? We agree with OG that this belief that the victim has is valid, and the method of expressing yourself and such is bad, but it is valid, the belief that you have. But I'm going to flip this and say that government distorts the political platform in 3 ways. A, saying that you are influenced by inflammatory languages is an admission that you do not have this belief, that there are strong external factors that you do it because you're hypnotized, brainwashed by the politician. Secondly, this also sends a nuance that the demographic of supporter from this particular political leaning are just individuals who are easily influenced without any principle whatsoever, because while I'm influenced, it's not necessarily that I want to and I don't believe that this issue are that extreme. Thirdly, this sends a nuance that politician doesn't have a valid perspective and the issue is not that huge, because it's inflammatory languages, the harm is magnified beyond its real impact, and I'm just brainwashed as opposed to this is something that I believe to have that massive impact and to be that extreme, to want to this extreme extent. What are the impact of this? There are 4 impacts. Firstly, on-site government, you make people admit and attack their beliefs so that they get a lighter sentences, saying and admitting that they are just bigot, no thoughts, head empty. Secondly, this invalidates the issue that they are representing. If it is true, like OG said, that these people are protecting themselves in self-defense, when you say that this is not you, then you say that it's not an active decision that you made, but rather an influence done by the external factor, you destroy the political platform and the perspective that they have. Thirdly, this provides the capacity to minimize the harm and active issue by the opposition. I mean, Democrats are great, but they're not nuanced when they disregard individuals who are scared of the caravan of immigrants. This leads to less compromises because you admit that their supporter is invalid and they're just being, brainwashed. Fourthly, this means CGS have to take a side. I think court should be specific and politic-free, at least not to take a side, but sadly, more inflammatory language are often used by right wing. When court actively damage and admit that their belief is invalid through the passage and through this particular admission of guilt, you ensure that future policy and future laws that is going to provide that by CGS is not going to consider, for example, how extreme they are and how easily influenced they are by inflammatory languages. The conclusion of this argument is that we agree that these are valid issues, even though the methods are wrong. On-site government, if you really care about the supporter, you shot themselves in the leg. How then you should weigh this argument? 3 ways. Firstly, the true principle of self-defense is you actively have a reason to fight. It's not self-defense on-site government when you say that you don't have anything to defend and you're just actively invalidating yourself. Secondly, the harm on our side is the person who instigates the right to be that choose. The harm on-site government is that you actively damages the political platform because validating and saying that they are only influenced actively damages every single right-wing belief, as opposed to on our side, it only damages one individual who instigated the riot to be that huge. This flips the government argument on caring for this individual. On side government, you maintain the political perspective that they have. I think more likely it's going to increase more inflammatory language in political discussion, because politician is also aware that their follower can get away with this, hence they will instigate more individuals to mobilize this particular huge manner, or are so more willing to use this as a method because they are aware that they can use this as a defense. Side government, you're also saying that this is a mitigating factor. It's a concession. This is our valid methods so long as they are influenced. This is bad because if you have a precedent of the penalizing, admitting that their methods are not valid, then you're actively validating their method so long as they are influenced. This increase more inflammatory languages inside the political discussion. The conclusion of Hughes' identity is that one, we do understand that these are valid issues that this individual are bringing. Government actively damages the issues by invalidating it and admit that they are only influenced. And secondly, this also increased more inflammatory languages in this political discussion. Yada yada yada. Proud to open.
Thank you for that speech. Let's invite government.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. My preferred method of PI is through the chat box. Please do not unmute yourself. Preferred gender pronouns are any. I don't really have a preference. Now I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, throughout my speech, I'm going to be making an analysis where I will be mainly talking about the main things that we have been seeing going on through this debate, which is accountability and justification, right? Let's take a look on what we have seen coming from side opposition. On side opposition, we see that there are no check and balances or an actual system to hold politicians accountable, or to at least put them under scrutiny for influencing people into doing something so costly and risky, such as these riots, right? And opposition loves to advocate for the narrative where they paint these people as having complete agency and that they claim that a politician's influence isn't enough of a justification, right? But we find this very contradictory, especially coming from opening opposition, because two reasons. Number one, they even went on a tangent just to tell you how there are many external factors that can affect the capability to influence a person's opinion and decision making, right? But opposition was bringing up these examples of things like movies and pamphlets and so on and so forth, which makes us raise the question on their stance of this debate of whether or not they actually want to agree that external factors do have the capability of influencing a person or not, right? Because apparently they are trying to tell you that things like movies have that capability, but opposition wants to completely draw the line at politicians, right? Because this kind of rhetoric that they are advocating for, it comes up very harmful and stripping these public figures of accountability and scrutiny for how they can, affect general masses, especially when not everyone is going to, watch a movie or read a pamphlet, for example, but everyone is going to see a politician's speech or recent controversial take, for example, on the articles. And we know everyone is going to see a politician's tweet on social media, right? So we think that this argument that is coming from them has been quite contradictory to what they want to defend. But on the second point, regarding power dynamics, we need to keep in mind, importantly, that a very crucial and very main key to this debate is the unique position that politicians are placed in, right? We think it is completely unfair and unjustified for side opposition to completely ignore and set this aside throughout their case. My first speaker has already very holistically analyzed to you of how, number one, these politicians are public figures who have a large audience and a widespread reach, right? First of all, they have people who either look up to them or people who are strongly opposed to their values, right? Because, for example, how these values can deeply affect them and their grievances, and, for example, their unjust conditions and so on and so forth, right? So these politicians are already put on a pedestal to begin with. They are people that the general masses look up to, and pay close attention to the things they say and so on and so forth. But most importantly, these power dynamics have always been a factor of consideration in the justice system, right? This is why, for example, someone who has committed first degree deliberate murder is going to receive a much bigger and much more severe punishment, as opposed to someone who has committed murder because they were influenced, for example, by another person or another mastermind, right? So what does this prove to you? It shows you exactly that the law doesn't turn a blind eye when there are cases where power dynamics and influence especially when it has this kind of inflammatory nature in the work to begin with, right? But thirdly, notice that there will always be less accountability on politicians coming from side opposition, regardless of what they try to tell you. Because I will also worst case is still going to be let's find to where right crimes other right and I because of ability who have less power like by using the disproportionate level of power that they have in comparison, right? That is the best case that opposition is trying to bring in this debate. However, let's compare this to our worst case. Sure, we will bite the bullet and be charitable to their side. Let's say that there are some cases after all where some people actually, do shift the blame to have a lighter sentencing, for example. But we do tell you that aside from the fact that we have already explained why this kind of blame is principally justified, practically speaking, we still think this is okay and much better than even opposition's best case, because at the very least on our side this kind of blame will always put the spotlight on how public figures have the capability to impact and harm their communities, right? And as well as their people, simply by the way they behave or speak, due to the fact that they already have so much power to begin with, right? But most importantly, this is also going to incentivize these politicians to engage even less in making inflammatory rhetoric, because we need to know the kind of interest that they have as these public figures, right? Which is 2 points. Number one, they want to remain in power, and secondly, they want to get reelected, right? But so what we need to know is that when this law shapes the public moral compass, and people can see that these politicians are, igniting crimes or making people start riots beyond simply just a few articles being written about it, but there is actual tangible consequences that the community can clearly see, and people are being made aware of because we are holding them more accountable. This puts their interest in danger, right? Their interest to stay in this kind of power and to actually be reelected, for example. It actually because it puts their interest at risk, it gives them a more tangible consequence to the kinds of things they say and to the kinds of ideas they put out into the public. Therefore, we say that when it comes to accountability, side government clearly wins this debate. And this is why we think it is the only way we are able to hold them accountable. This is the case we are very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. And to close the entire debate, let's invite opposition whip here.
Check, is this audible?
Yes, it is.
Right, PI chat, please. Yeah. I'll start my speech. PI chat, Jennifer Stadium. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 2 points of clarification. Firstly, OG argument is literally just an argument for riot and protest. Why riot is good and why protest is good. They still exist regardless, because if the issue is that massive, such as indigenous discrimination or authoritarian regime, for example, most of them, by the way, are not moved by inflammatory public statement, but by continuous prosecution in the region. It is irrelevant, hence, for OG to argue so, because you cannot say Jokowi influenced my action, where literally what Jokowi says only, yo nggak tahu kok nanya saya, for instances. Because if the parameter is that low, just as very simple wording might become inflammatory public statement as well. It means that in opening government, you allow riot with low reasons that harm people, but give them low punishment. It's literally FA movement in Solo, for example, which throw rocks to Chinese housing, uses the justification of mayor of Solo for public statement correlated to a Catholicism, for example, so on and so forth. What does this clarification try to show you is that all argument regarding minority rioting because of self-defense, for example, is in theory very irrelevant and can be achieved regardless. Further, it harms the democracy. We will argue that it's harmed the democracy further using their own parameter, where the leeway of inflammatory public statement become lower and lower. If they want to be the parameter to be there is a valid reason to riot and there is a certain public statement that being created, hence it might expand diversity. Hence, it's quite easy to some extent to use any speeches as inflammatory public statement if there is a certain grievances that the public eventually have. In this particular case means you allow individual to eventually do riot and harms other people in general and get a low amount of punishment. And that's in generally something that's flaw in the democracy, because it means that you allow people to do quote unquote anarchism action, for example, where they do their own law conduct, for example, just because they are quote unquote have a certain reason of valid reason, for example. It shows the inconsistency of principle that opening government want to defend it in and of itself something that's harmful. But secondly, for opening government and closing government, it is not the debate about punishing politician. If you want to punish politician because of inflammatory public statement, do it on another debate. We don't care. To some extent, if we want, we can agree, because the motion specifically talk on protester is not a politician. It is not mutually exclusive to claim that this statement is inflammatory and punishing the protester without mitigating factor. Hence, in our side of the house, we punish individual. But even further, we will argue that punishing this kind of politician is something that is injury very hard, even if you have the argument coming from public or legal precedents coming from opening government. Why is that so? Because the way for you to eventually punish a certain inflammatory public statement, you need to be in the statement in and of itself need to be on the step of hate speech to begin with. The reason why, because in terms of policy and in terms of lawmaking, the one that you can punish is hate speech. Inflammatory anger speech, for example, is a style of speeches that you cannot punish, because you want an inclusion between one type of tribes and diversity in terms of the way individual or in the way politicians eventually do their statement or do their speeches, for instances. Hence, in their side of the house, if they want to punish inflammatory public statement, they need to prove why then this kind of public statement eventually enters to the parameter of hate speech, that most of it might be not, for instance, so on and so forth. And we will argue as well, it's very hard to punish politicians because of a lot of backing coming from the other politicians, for example, company that they own, for example, lobbying toward court, for instance, and so forth, and the connection between politician and court, where politicians are the one able to influence or even to some extent appoint who are the court, Supreme Court judges, for example, of the house. They literally punish no one. But in our side of the house, we eventually put accountability toward the individual action. Next thing that I want to talk about is two things. Firstly, I'll talk about intention. Second, about check and balance and why we win in that particular clash. So firstly, in terms of intention, is it true that people have no ability to process information to have certain rationality? Let's talk about for external factor. I don't understand why opening government suddenly come and only say external factor. There need to be a certain parameter or certain nuance. Why then external factor should be the utmost priority in terms of mitigating factor? Why is that so? Because external factors should be balanced in terms of the symmetry of power between individual and the way they gain information. And we would like to argue that asymmetrical of power do not really exist in the particular case due to 5 reasons. Number one, most of rioters are those who actively participating in the politics. This means most of them have access to a diverse type of media to eventually understand that there is also diverse type of style of speeches, for example, that might be different in terms of hate speech and those certain things. Hence, in this particular case, means we will argue that the voter, the rioters, for example, are someone that in theory rational and have time to eventually process. Secondly, Capitol Riot literally contain the most educated individual that apart from anger, they do have rationality and education regarding diverse type of politician speech, for example. That by the way, Bobby's frame, as they have alternative to eventually do protest in a more peaceful way, for example, rather than do inherent riot and harming other people in general. But thirdly, there is time gap as well between statement and being stated and the said riot. Mobilizing masses require coordination first. Hence, in this particular case, they do have time to have external parties to influence you to rationally think. But fourthly, if the parameter is only external factor, I should get mitigating factor, for instance, to kill my father because my father abused my mother mentally, for example. But that's never been the case. There should be a balance on that, and that's gone in government budgets and never being explained. Hence, the principal parameter of politics of external factor in opening government, at the end of the day, it's just a simple a premise, but without explanation. Fifthly, even if in this case that even if in this scenario is that they do have being cult of personality or something like that, we'll argue where we don't want to have voters that easily influenced by this kind of action and conduct. Why is that so? It creates a habituation that the voter are completely fine to be inflammatory, to be influenced by this kind of inflammatory public statement, and it is not their fault. This gives the nuance that you don't give the responsibility to voters to eventually become more rational in terms of voting. Do note that it is individual that will vote further in our politics, the one that able to eventually influence 5 years upfront and what kind of policy that we want to have. In this particular case, you want the individual to be as rational as possible that can eventually think whether or not a certain statement is something that is surely valid, for instance. If you are, it's very easily to say that I'm not the one that at fault for my own conduct or my own action. It means that you are not responsible toward your own action and toward your own rationality. Hence, it harms your ability. It actually harms the point that your vote might not be matter as well because it might be influenced by any other factor. Hence, it creates a position that even the democracy in and of itself is something that invalid from this kind of individual. But let's talk about check and balance. Then, incentive to mitigate and prosecute politicians. Number one, opening government never explain the incentive because they are not punished harshly, mostly that this individual doesn't have the incentive to eventually do so. Hence, check and balance exists in opposition. Firstly, there's a massive harm inducted to you when you are prosecuted. Hence, there is a nuance that politicians might ruin your life, for example. Secondly, there's a huge amount of stagnation in government benches. When you do riot to listen to Ben Shapiro, for example, it as simple as saying that I might be influences in my irrationality, for example, hence do not punish me. In this particular case, because of the cult of personality, exactly what opening government say, they might not push for the prosecution of individual, they can just run away by saying those kind of things, especially when this kind of inflammatory public statement might not be punished due to the threshold of being in the hate speech. But let's talk about legal precedent. Not first that OG quite bizarre on arguing this. There's no way in hell suddenly if you have legal precedent, suddenly people will mobilize because there need to be public agreement in majority or even in unanimity, for example. Hence, the tipping point of this debate should be on in which side democracy and the validation of information or validation of speeches do exist. And that exists in both these. For those reasons,
Okay, thank you so much for that speech, and that marks the end of this debate. Thank you so much, everyone, and wait for the announcement in the main room. Thank you. For the judges, I think we will deliberate here.